Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. This episode is part two of my conversation with Jon Picoult, a customer experience strategist, author, and someone who has a rare gift for translating behavioral science into practical, repeatable moves that leaders can actually deploy. In part one, we established a simple but disruptive idea. Customers don't remember everything, yet their memory drives everything. And as Jon laid out, the difference between satisfied and impressed is not a bigger budget, it's smarter design. Now, in the second half of my conversation with him, we shift from the architecture of experience to the signals that shape it in real time, especially when things feel uncertain, complex, or high stakes. So let's jump back into the conversation and unpack more principles that turn customers into fans and customer experiences into lasting advantage. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Why do people feel better, both emotionally and physically, when they're given choices, even small choices? And I love the example you give in the book of which arm to use for a blood draw.
Yeah, so I love that study too. It's very amusing. This is a gentleman by the name of Richard Mills. He was a psychology student at the University of Southern California, and he decided to do this experiment with the local Red Cross blood donor facility. And what he did is he basically divided the blood donors on a given day into two groups, a group A, group B. And with group A, he told the phlebotomist, the nurse taking the blood, that she should just ask the donor, which is your non-dominant arm? And that was the one that they would then draw the blood from. But with the other group of donors, they had the phlebotomist ask the blood donor, which arm would you like me to draw the blood from? And at the end of the day, Richard Mills interviewed all the blood donors and basically asked them, how much pain did you feel through this procedure? And how did you feel about the experience of giving blood? And amazingly, he found the people who were given choice of arm actually said they felt less pain during the procedure, and they were significantly happier with the experience of donating blood. And the only difference between the two groups was that this group was given the choice of which arm to give blood from. And you could argue that is a meaningless choice, right? Right arm or left arm, it is still a stranger coming at you with a sharp needle. So how does it make a difference? And the answer has to do with what's known as perceived control, which again is a psychological concept that basically says we as human beings, we like to be in control of our surroundings. We like to be in control of our destiny. But in many businesses, you can't give your customer direct behavioral control. Blood donations, for example, I can't draw the blood myself. I have to delegate that to the phlebotomist. But what the research has shown is that there's a very good proxy for giving people direct behavioral control, and that is giving them the sense, the perception that they have control. And if you do that, they will actually feel better about whatever experience they are going through, even if you don't lift a finger to improve the underlying mechanics of the experience. And so that's what was happening with the blood donation experiment. Is one way to give people perceived control is to give them the power of agency. That is, giving them the opportunity to actually shape the experience by making choices, however small and insignificant. And so just me saying, I would prefer if you take the blood from my left arm, suddenly I feel like I'm exerting some control over that entire encounter. And as a result, I feel better about the experience. And as Richard Mills found, I actually feel less pain as a result. So ambiguity is the enemy here. If you want to rob people of the perception of control, you want to basically give them no choices so they feel like they're railroaded and have no control over what's going on. You want to shower them with ambiguity and uncertainty. And if you do all of those things, I guarantee you'll leave a poor impression on them. But conversely, if you just do some small things to give them a sense of control, it's almost magical what the impact is on the impressions that are left on them.
That sense of autonomy is so important with consumers and with employees as well, in making for a meaningful experience.
Just to mention about the employee piece, because you said earlier the 12 principles can be applied to any constituency that you serve. And this one is a really important one for employees. Think about how often employees, because they're not communicated with well by their leadership, feel like they don't know what's going on. There's something they've heard about, they think it might affect them in their role, but nobody has spoken to them about it. That is an example of robbing the employee of a sense of control. And it immediately makes them feel less good about the job that they're in and their plight. And let me tell you, that it will bleed into the customer experience that they are tasked with delivering. So, yeah, in the employee arena, the notion of giving people the perception of control just by being a leader that communicates well, that's a great example of that.
Even small things can make a big difference. So just be more open, more aware, more deliberate with your approach regarding that. But beyond control, customers also want proof that you're in their corner, advocating for their interests in very visible, tangible ways. And that's principle seven is being an advocate. So, what does it mean to be an advocate for your customer? And how did Southwest Airlines really embody this customer advocacy with the role that Herb Keller played in democratizing the skies?
Being an advocate for your customer essentially means that the customer sees that you, the company, are putting the customer's interests ahead of your own. Instead of worrying about lining your own pockets, you're looking at how can I enrich the life of my customer? And of course, the unspoken rule there is if I enrich my customer's life in the short term, I might not make as much money, but in the long term, I'll make even more because I'll be building a lifelong customer. And the thing about customer advocacy is that this is an arena where talk is cheap because any company in their marketing materials or on their website could say, we put customers first. Anybody could say that. What this principle is about is tangible demonstrations of advocacy, because that's the kind of thing that makes people pay attention and creates one of those peaks that you remember. And so you mentioned Southwest Airlines. And for a half century, they dominated the customer experience ratings, not just for airlines, but they were highly rated across any industry. And a lot of it came back to their co-founder, Herb Kelleher, who you mentioned, who his guiding principle when he first started Southwest is he wanted to democratize air travel. He wanted to make air travel accessible to the masses, not just to the business people and the affluent. And so the entire Southwest operating model was really oriented around creating a very positive passenger experience coupled with a very competitive airfare. And so this is what advocacy looks like in the airline industry. It's the notion of I'm not trying to maximize my revenue from every seat at every moment. I'm trying to make sure you walk away feeling like you got really good value for the money that you paid. Another example of it is Southwest for a long time said, we're not going to nickel and dime you. And that's why we're not going to charge for your bags. They actually had a word for it. They called it transparency, which meant that their pricing was completely transparent. There were no gotcha fees or charges, which was often the case with other airlines. And actually, I'll give you a final example with Southwest, and that is during COVID. During COVID, Southwest blocked all of the middle seats on its aircraft so that it would create, by design, space between passengers who chose to fly during the pandemic. Now, most every airline actually did this for a short period of time once the pandemic descended upon us. But what was different about Southwest is they didn't stop this procedure, this policy after a couple of months like other airlines did. They actually kept it all the way through into late 2020. And think about it. Think about how much revenue Southwest lost by virtue of blocking every middle seat on every flight. That's a lot of money, a lot of lost fares. But they did it because they thought it would make their customers comfortable, going back to the emotion that you're stirring. And they really believed that if they did it, it was a signal to their customers that, hey, we're watching out for you. And if they see that we're watching out for them, they'll reward us with their business over the long term.
Smart strategy. And you're right. They align that model very effectively with culture to make flying accessible and fair, earning enduring loyalty, profitability through tangible proof points rather than these campaigns. But you also need to make sure that you offer what people consistently want and matters to them. And that's the next principle of creating relevance, which is really hard to do in this day and age where it seems like the needle keeps moving to another area. So, what does it mean to create relevance? And can you talk more about the context of it in the customer experience?
So, relevance is about creating an experience for your customers that seems perfectly suited for what they need at that particular moment in time within that particular environment that they find themselves. I feel seen and I feel heard. Like you're giving me a product or a service that just seems perfect for the situation that I find myself in. Going back again to the memory science here, relevant experience is a remembered experience. Just the way our brains work, when we encounter something that feels very pertinent to us, we remember it for a lot longer than things that seem more irrelevant to us. And so relevance not only helps to create that better experience in the moment, it also helps to facilitate that longer term memory of it. Now, to give you an example of like what relevance looks like, is one of the most common questions in Disney World in Orlando, Florida. One of the most common questions that Disney employees in the theme park get is, what time is the 3 o'clock parade? Okay, right? Like, why are people asking that? What Disney trains its cast members, as they call employees, is when people are asking you that, what's relevant to them, what they're really asking is not what time is the 3 o'clock parade. They're asking, what time does the 3 o'clock parade get to me where I am standing? And so they train their cast members, very carefully to answer in that way, not to look people in the eye and say, are you an idiot? That's not that's not how they interact. And so that's an example of relevance, communicating in a relevant way, knowing what is it that your customer's really asking, what's really meaningful to them. And so you can also look, for example, at GPS enabled experiences. So like Google search, where you search for, a pizza place. Before smartphones were GPS enabled, you would get a list of pizza places in your entire zip code. But now you do that search on Google, what's going to come back? The ones that are going to come back at the top are the ones that are steps away from you. And that's because what Google is really guessing is that what you're really asking, what's really relevant to you is, where is there a pizza place near me right now? Because I'm hungry and I want pizza. So that's what a relevant experience is about, is just figuring out what's really on your customer's mind. What do they really care about deeply? And then engineering the products, the services, and the whole experience in a way that's going to target that and therefore resonate more strongly with them.
And Rich Carlton does this very well with his customer experience, asking the question behind the question so that you really understand what's the reason why they're asking this, right? It's not the 3 p.m. parade. They know it starts at 3. When does it get to me, or when should I start sitting down and lining up for it so I can get a great spot? It's asking that question behind the question. And when relevance is high, details become leverage because small signals can elevate or erode the entire impression. So, principle 9 really, it's pay attention to the details of the experience. And I love the lampshade effect, how small mistakes can lead customers to infer larger problems about a product.
Yeah, so the importance of details is that while our brains, we just might remember the peaks, the valleys, and the last thing that happens to us. We're not wired to remember every detail in the experience, but we can certainly be influenced by every detail, even if that's subconsciously. And so the lampshade effect, what that refers to is, the name is coined from Ritz-Carlton's approach to getting a room set up for a new guest. The housekeeping staff has a 200-point checklist that they check to make sure that a room is in perfect working order for a newly arriving guest. And the reason that they do that is because they know that if there is a crooked lampshade, say beside the bed, that their discerning clientele is going to come into that room, they're going to see that, and even if it's subconscious, they're going to look at that crooked lampshade and they're going to wonder, what else isn't quite right here? And that's what the lampshade effect is all about. It's about people's tendency to take a small error or oversight in the customer experience and infer from it that something bigger may be amiss. And so this is why it's so critical to pay attention to the details, to dot the I's and to cross the T's. A misspelling in a piece of correspondence, an unpleasant smell in a waiting room, a cluttered display in a store, a curt greeting from a customer service representative. These are all small details, but they have the opportunity subconsciously to start shifting people's perceptions about what this experience really feels like. And so you never want to lose sight of the minutia.
And the remedy, you're right, is to sweat the small stuff and leverage those sensory cues so that every detail reinforces the intended impression rather than contradicting it. And details, they also power our personalization of the experience, which starts with tuning your antenna to pick up on opportunities in real time. And Principle 10 is all about personalizing that experience. What does putting your antenna mean in the context of personalizing these customer interactions?
Yeah, so this is a phrase that comes from Ritz Carlton again. They are a great model for any company, even if you're not in a luxury business, just because they're obviously perennially rated among the best in customer experience, and they're just really good at designing the experience very intentionally and deliberately. And so the advice that they give their teams is put your radar on and your antenna up. And what that means is they're encouraging their employees to always stay present in the moment so that they can spot hotel guests' overt needs as well as their unexpressed wishes. And it's one of the ways that Ritz Carlton is really good at delivering a strikingly personalized customer experience. And so, what it means, for example, in the Ritz Carlton context, is if I am the Ritz Carlton door person and somebody is walking in and they greet me sort of more formally, they say, good evening, maybe, versus someone else who walks by me and says, how's it going? I'm actually going to adjust how I respond to them based on the level of formality that they indicate they're comfortable with, given how they're communicating with me as the door person. And that's an example of keeping your antenna up. I could be working in housekeeping at the Ritz Carlton, and I could hear a guest say, "Oh my gosh, I love the scent of this candle that they have burning in the hallway." And Ritz Carlton has systems where their housekeepers could go in and basically say, this guest loves the smell of this candle. And you know what? The next day, you might find in your room is a complimentary candle of that scent. You might find 6 months later, when you stay at a Ritz Carlton halfway around the world, when you check in, that candle is going to be in your room. That is an intensely personalized experience. And it all comes about because people on the front line have their antenna up and they're just always listening and watching for little cues that help them to see what would make this special for that customer. And then they record that and then they act on it in the future.
And you're right. It means actively listening for those small bits of information, the names, milestones, preferences, in live interactions and capturing digital footprints so communications and offers and service can really be tailored to the individual, which I think is becoming more and more important in this day and age. But once these basics of personalization are in place, you mentioned the next part of the process, principle number 11, is small, pleasant surprises can become signature moments that people remember and share. So don't discount those. Talk to me more about that, how consistent delivery of these small, pleasant surprises contribute to a brand's long term differentiation.
So it's important to note for your audience, this is one of those principles that you want to be careful not to focus on this too early in your journey to really differentiate your customer experience because the fundamentals are key. No matter what kind of really unexpected, pleasant surprise that I throw into the experience that might create, a really tall peak, it's going to be meaningless if you don't deliver on the basics for me. Just the fundamentals that I come to your business for, because if those are absent, then I'm going to have a whole series of valleys that will offset the peak of the pleasant surprise. But assuming that you are delivering on the fundamentals relatively consistently, throwing in some pleasant surprises, things that people just absolutely didn't expect, is a very effective way to create very tall peaks that people remember. And this is something that just happens at a neuroscience level. When we encounter something that's really surprising, that surprise basically hijacks our cognitive resources as our brain tries to make sense of what it's seeing. This is why, if you're at a surprise party for a friend or a family member, and they walk in the door and everybody jumps out behind the furniture and yells surprise, what happens? They like actually freeze for a minute. And that is because their brain is just, everything is stopping and their brain is just focusing on what it is seeing to try to make sense of it. Now, the thing is, the consequence of that is it helps to form long-term memories, which again gets to why this notion of these surprises forge those memories that can really create brand differentiation. If you've never shopped at Nordstrom, the first time you go there, you might be surprised when you pay for your merchandise that the Nordstrom rep, after ringing up the purchase, instead of putting the shirt that you bought in a bag and then handing it to you over the sales counter, they're actually going to put it in the bag and they're going to walk around the entire sales counter and then turn to you, look you in the eye, hand you the bag, thank you for coming to Nordstrom, and wish you a good day. And if you've never been to Nordstrom before, when this happens, you're like, what planet am I on? Because you just do not see this in retail environments. Standard retail environment, they just want to shoo you off away from that register as quickly as possible. Like, I'm throwing the merchandise to you and shooing you away. But here you've got this really strange, almost choreographed dance where the Nordstrom rep walks around the counter and looks you in the eye and hands you the merchandise. Now, it is the kind of thing that people remember because it's just, you don't see that. And indeed, it becomes one of those signature elements of the Nordstrom experience that the next time you come back to Nordstrom, you're almost waiting to see that again because for you, it's part of that encounter. So that's what I mean about a pleasant surprise. But going back to my first point, that Nordstrom rep, they could walk around the counter and hand it to me and give me the most authentic, genuine, fond farewell. But if it took me 30 minutes to just find someone in the men's department to help me buy a shirt, then it does not matter. They could have done a double Sukahara flip over that sales counter. I'm still not going to be impressed. So you got to sequence things here, and you got to make sure you don't focus on the pleasant surprises at the expense of the basics.
A consistent cadence of these simple branded delights become part of the story that the customers tell about you, assuming you have the essentials nailed and they have a good overall experience of your product. But even great systems fail sometimes. So that final principle is really recover with style. What specific behaviors, such as maybe ownership, responsiveness, and urgency, define a strong recovery effort? Because inevitably, all brands, companies are going to fail at something at some point in time. How do you recover better, faster, quicker?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to stress is those beloved brands, those legendary companies we've been talking about, whether it's Ritz-Carlton or Disney or Amazon or whatnot. It's not as though they are immune to failures in the customer experience. What makes those companies different is that they recognize that if there is a failure in the experience, that they don't have to resign themselves to creating a dissatisfied customer. Because what they realize is that if you overcorrect on the recovery, if you knock the cover off the ball on the recovery, what you're really doing is creating a peak in the experience. And oh, by the way, it comes at the end. Because usually if you are doing a recovery, it is at the end of the encounter. So when you recover with style, it's playing off of some of the other principles that we've talked about because you're essentially creating this peak at the end of the experience that eclipses the negativity of the failure itself. This has been researched quite extensively, and what's been found, it's called the service paradox, is that very often you can end up with a more loyal customer after a failure that you recover very well on, as compared to before the failure ever occurred, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think, if I fail a customer, how do I make them more loyal as a result? But you actually can. And so in terms of how you engineer those kinds of recoveries, what does recover with style really mean? What I would tell your audience is, first, lots of business people are fixers at heart. You go into business, you're usually good at fixing things, but your customer at a point of failure, that actually might not be what's relevant to them initially. The notion of just wanting an immediate fix. This goes back to the relevance principle. But very often, customers who have experienced some kind of failure in their interactions with a business, the first thing that they really want is to know that they're seen and heard, to know that you empathize with them, that you understand the impact that this failure has had on them, their family, their lifestyle, whatever. And so the first order of business in recovering with style is really just to listen and to demonstrate empathy before you move on to creating the solution. That's job one. Now, once you've done that, then all the words that you mentioned are critical: ownership, responsiveness, urgency. If there is ever a time to demonstrate advocacy for your customer, it's when they have experienced a failure. And the way you demonstrate advocacy in that situation is you take exceptional ownership for making sure that you've made them whole. That means that you're quarterbacking the entire recovery. Even if you've got to get lots of different people involved from lots of different departments, there's always one person, one throat to choke, if you will. And it's that person who's on point, and the customer knows, okay, Jon Picoult is my point person. He's going to make this happen for me. And so the customer wants to see that you're approaching it with urgency, that you're taking exceptional ownership. This is a place where you can't drop the ball twice. If you really want to scuttle the customer's impression, all you got to do is fail them once and then fail them during the recovery. And then that's it. You're never going to get another chance. So the execution of the recovery is really critical. And then once all the dust settles, that's when you can actually think of, can I throw a pleasant surprise in here at the end of the recovery? Something that this customer might never have expected. So the dust settles, and maybe I send them a handwritten note, just with one final, genuine, authentic communication of empathy and apologizing, maybe offering some credit to future business or something like that they might not have expected. Because again, the idea is, I don't want to just make my customer whole. I want to make them whole, and I want to create a peak that is going to actually become a brand builder as opposed to a brand detractor.
I love how you threw multiple principles in there to showcase how they could be used in that recovery effort. Let's move into a practical example with a big company using these different principles. And one of them that you list in the book is IKEA. I think everyone knows IKEA, the furniture distributor. They probably use all 12, but perhaps let's focus on three of the principles that we've just discussed out of the 12 that IKEA really does well to create an amazing customer experience.
Yeah, so if I had to pick three, let me start first with creating relevance. One thing that IKEA did some years ago is they developed an augmented reality app called IKEA Place. It became very popular, and IKEA is the largest furniture store in the world. They routinely get very high customer ratings for their target clientele. And the IKEA app actually has been a very important driver in their success. And what the IKEA Place app allows you to do is it allows you to take your smartphone, basically train it on a room in your house or your office or whatever, and then you could pick any piece of furniture that IKEA sells, and you just drops it right in through augmented reality. And you can walk around, you can see it from different angles, you can see how it's going to look in that room. And the reason this ties into creating relevance is because what IKEA realized is people don't really care about their furniture. What they care about is how their furniture is going to look in their home. And so the IKEA Place app was really the solution for addressing what was relevant to their customers. And that's why it was such a big hit. And so that's one principle that I think they used very effectively. A second that I would say they use very effectively is stirring emotion, because IKEA is all about great deals. Their entire operation, the way they source materials, the way they design their products, the whole supply chain, is really designed to deliver furniture at a very reasonable, affordable cost. And so the emotion that stirs in their clientele is, it almost creates like a positive feeling of having beat the system. Instead of going to the traditional furniture store where you're shelling out thousands of dollars to decorate a room and to furnish a room, I can go to IKEA and I could do it for, a fraction of the cost. And that really does stir emotion with their customers, because it's just, you're getting such value that you feel invigorated by it. Like you've beat the system and you've found something that nobody else knows about, and you're laughing all the way to the bank. So that would be the second principle I would highlight. And then the third one I would say would be the pleasant surprises. Not all 12 principles have to be used all the time. It depends on the nature of your business, which ones you want to accentuate. So pleasant surprises with IKEA, think of it like this. IKEA is actually not effortless to do business with, if you think about it. If I want to buy a light bulb from IKEA, I have to snake through the entire showroom just to get to the final warehouse floor where I can pick that light bulb up off the shelf. That is not effortless. That's time consuming. But that is actually done by design, because one of the things that's important to IKEA's customer experience is they're trying to deliver pleasant surprises by, in essence, forcing people to go through this circuitous route through the showroom, because what they see is they discover something that they didn't even intend to come there to look for. But it's like they say, my gosh, look at that lamp, or wow, look at that chair, or I love that dresser. And so part of the IKEA experience and what their target clientele loves is the notion that I'm not looking to speed through. The fact that I have to weave through all the different rooms in the warehouse just to go get a light bulb, it actually isn't the worst thing in the world, because I find I discover something, a pleasant surprise, that I end up going home with. And I didn't come there to get it, but I fall in love with it, and it helps to enhance, the place I'm living in or where I'm working. So those are three examples of principles that I'd say they use very effectively, as well as one that they consciously choose not to double down on because it's just not central to their brand story.
Before we wrap up today, I'd like to ask one more question. If you could leave our customers with just one challenge, the people listening to this podcast with one piece of advice to make their organizations more impression worthy, what would it be?
I would give you a strategic answer and a tactical answer. And strategically, my advice to create an impression worthy experience is to always ask yourself, how do I make my customer feel special? Because that makes all the difference. When we talked earlier about the importance of emotion in the experience, and the notion of when you make your customer feel special, when you make them feel important, that has legs. You get a lot of leverage from that, and it really helps to cement long-term loyalty. So that's at a strategic level. Let me give you an example, just at a tactical approach for how you can make your customer feel special in any business. And it's going to sound very commonsensical, but it's something a lot of companies miss on. And it's simply this: do what you said you'll do. It's so often that companies just fail to honor the commitments that they make to their customers. Even something as simple as I call my health insurer and they've got a complex issue they need to research, and I'm on the phone with them, and the rep says, okay, Mr. Picoult, I'll have to research this and I will call you back. And what I'm thinking at that moment, along with everybody else in that situation, I'm thinking, I'm never going to hear from you again. Never. And I'm just going to have to invest more of my time and effort calling you back, retelling my story to some other rep. But when people just honor their commitments and say, oh, Mr. Picoult, I got to research this, but I'm going to call you by tomorrow at 5 p.m. and tell you what I found. And then you actually follow up and honor that commitment, that does make me feel special. It makes me feel like you're treating me more than just a number, more than just another revenue source. You're treating me as an individual that you actually care about, and you're trying to enrich my life in some way. So that would be my advice to your listeners. Think about, how do you make your customers feel special? And if you're looking for a way to do that just day in and day out, an example is simply honor your commitments, deliver on your promises, do what you said you'll do.
Great piece of advice to end it on. Thank you so much, Jon, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Sure. So the best way is to go to my website, which is jonpicoult.com. That's JONPICOULT.com. From there, you can learn more about my book, my speaking services, as well as my company, Watermark Consulting.
Thank all of you for listening. Remember, don't aim to satisfy your customers. Build an experience they're going to remember and recommend. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.